Good morning, everyone. It is Tuesday, June the 16th, 2020. It is currently 9:17 a.m. Central Time, and I have this voice inside of me, this voice in the back of my head that is telling me, Trevor, just stop right now. I know you already hit the go live button, but just hit the stop button and just end the live broadcast right there. No one will know what you were going to talk about. They're going to see the title, but they're not going to know what you said, and just leave it there. And everyone will tune in, and you'll get the same number of downloads because they'll see it, but they won't actually hear what you have to say, because anything you say in regards to this subject, Trevor, yeah, you're going to listen to me have an internal dialogue with myself, right? Okay, but my part of myself is saying, hey, you know that no matter what you say here, you're going to make someone mad. This is a no-win situation for you, and I know it's a no-win situation because here is the weird thing. I don't know if you've ever felt this way. I know some of you have, because you've expressed it in your emails about your struggle with the church and with Christianity. And I definitely feel like this. I feel that 95% of the time, I'm an outsider to the Christian world. I don't feel like I'm accepted in the Christian world. I'm just not there. Like if they're the way Christians think, the way they talk, I'm not there. I'm not there. And it drives me crazy because, like, on one hand, it's irritating not to be accepted. At times you feel like you're not accepted within the Christian world. And it doesn't really matter how theologically sound, no matter how much I struggle to be theologically sound, study the Bible, study church history. It's really, this is the weird thing. It's really not theology and doctrine that gets me thrown out of Christianity. It comes to all of these secondary issues. Let me offer you this as an example. Someone wrote an article, posted something in regards to when all the celebrities were doing these cover versions of Imagine by John Lennon, right? And there was these different Christians who were saying things about the song by John Lennon and saying things. And so I jumped into a conversation and posted some comments that, like, hey, that's not a correct interpretation of the song. That's not what John Lennon was trying to say. And I would even state when I gave my comments, I'm not endorsing the philosophy of the song. I'm simply saying that you're misrepresenting what the song is actually about. And then the next thing you know, just simply trying to say, hey guys, I think if we're gonna criticize the song, we've got to make sure we have a correct understanding of what John Lennon was trying to say, because that's the only respectful way to do so. Let's listen to what he said about the song. Let's listen to what those who've studied the lyrics have to say, and let's offer a correct interpretation. Once we've correctly interpreted the song, then we can offer a fair criticism of it. Oh, no. Christians were not having any of that. In fact, I won't name the name of the individual. He works with a very big ministry. He attacked me. Not only attacked me, he basically attacked my church, because he's like, you claim, your website claims that your church is dedicated to the in-depth study of Scripture and church history. I highly doubt that. Well, he highly doubted that my church is committed to we're committed to the in-depth study of Scripture, theology, and church history, all because I simply said, hey, I think you're misinterpreting Imagine by John Lennon. I don't think you have the lyrics quite right. All of a sudden, then, if you do that, then boom, you're thrown out. Because I did not conform to their views of a popular song and their misinterpretation of it. See, that's how it works within Christianity. At any time, if you step up and go, whoa, wait a minute. I don't think that's the correct way to handle this. You've got to just go along with the company line. You got to go along with the party line. And now what will get you thrown out if you criticize Trump? Boom, you're out. You're a liberal. If you say, well, wait a minute, I think racism is a real issue. Oh, you're liberal, progressive, and you think you're woke. Well, wait a minute. I didn't say that. It's like no matter what you say, you can't. It's like you're just thrown out, because I think so much of our thinking today is not about the Bible. It's about everything else. So I know that this is a situation where no matter what I say, I'm going to make Christians upset with me. But you know what? I don't feel the desire to go along with the party line. I don't feel the desire that I have to conform. I know that if I don't, I'll be cast out, and I'll always be regulated to, to the never going to be relevant in the Christian world. And it's just sad. But there's got to be voices out there in the Christian world. There's got to be Christianity should be able to, if you don't know my history, I got thrown off Christian radio. Like, I may be the only pastor who got kicked off Christian radio, and I got kicked off Christian radio because I simply was challenging and criticizing what churches were doing when it came to the quote unquote Resurrection Sunday, or as many call it, Easter. And I was like, I don't think the Easter bunny is really what churches are supposed to be doing. I don't think an Easter egg hunt. Nope, you're gone. Whoa, wait, I can't. So within Christianity, I mean, you've got to toe the company line. You've got to do so. And if you don't, I'm sorry, your church has to operate the same way all the other churches do. You got to talk the same way. I mean, it's just crazy. It's that we can't accept any kind of voice that seems to offer a different perspective. So everything I've ever done, I always try to offer a different perspective. And typically the people who get the most angry with me, this is bizarre, it's usually Christians. It's, lost people don't hate me as much as, now lost people disagree with my view about there is a God. He is holy. There is no salvation apart from Jesus Christ. Without Jesus Christ, there is an eternal hell. They don't like that. But on so many other issues, they seem to think that I'm trying to offer some kind of reasoned response. So here is where we are today. Yesterday, the Supreme Court announced a ruling in regards to the LGBTQ world and laws that what they were basically, I'm going to try to summarize this. They passed a ruling that protects LGBTQ individuals from being discriminated in the workplace, that they cannot be fired because of their sexual identity, their sexual preference, their gender identity, etc. They cannot be fired. Simply put, I'm simplifying it. We're going to play some news clips that will explain it a little bit more, and I've got some articles here to explain it a little bit more. But for the beginning, I just want to give a basic summary. So I saw I got the notification of the news story. I started getting a few messages of how this is a historical, a pretty historic moment in American history, and this is a pretty major decision by the Supreme Court. And a part of me wanted to immediately hop in my car, drive out here to the church, grab the microphone, and start speaking. But immediately I knew that no matter what I say, I'm going to find myself having Christians get upset with me. And I'm like, well, how do I approach this? I said, I know what I'll do. I'll give it 24 hours. And I'll listen to all the Christian voices. And the Christian voices have basically, they've kind of approached it from a couple of perspectives. This is it. This is the end. America just reached a tipping point. We now are going to be under the curse, the judgment of God. The country, we're going to be destroyed. I mean, like basically, we're now Sodom and Gomorrah. It's over. Others felt like the problem with the Supreme Court ruling more was the way it handled there was a law, and the way they interpreted the law wasn't so much. They didn't really interpret the law. They expanded the law to capture the change that has happened in society. In other words, they didn't just interpret the law, they used the law and then reinterpreted in light of society today. And some say that that's not what the Supreme Court is supposed to do. So some criticized it on legal grounds. I think a third kind of thing I would hear is that, oh no, this is going to be the end of Christian organizations, and that churches are going to be in trouble, that Christian schools are going to be in trouble, and a lot of Christian ministries are going to be in trouble. And that is possible as well. I tried to talk to other Christians about it. I got some weird responses. Some basically argue that there should be no law. Now this This one caught me a little off guard. Basically, all discrimination laws that say you can't discriminate against someone because of their race or because of this, that basically there should be no discrimination laws, and a business should be able to do what, if they don't want to hire a person because they're an African American, they shouldn't have to hire a person if they're African American. If they don't want to hire a woman, they shouldn't have to hire a woman. If they don't want to hire a white person, they shouldn't have to hire a white person. There should just be no discrimination laws at all. Well, that's a little crazy. Like, how far do you take that? Businesses won't serve you. Like, you walk into a business and they ask you, I don't know how far you take that. I mean, that goes against everything that seems crazy. So I was hearing lots of crazy ideas, lots of, I was taken back by some of the different things I was hearing, but the Christian response was pretty straightforward. Hey, this is the end. We're under the judgment of God. This is the destruction of all that we know. It's all over. The rapture is going to happen in 3.2 seconds. Like a lot of extreme reactions. Now, of course, extreme reactions on the internet doesn't necessarily prove that that's how the average Christian feels. I have no idea how the average Christian feels. I think maybe the average Christian probably didn't even pay attention to what happened. So I'm like, well, how can I respond to this? So this is what we're going to do. We're going to try to walk through this. I'm going to try to be careful. I'm going to try to be logical. I'm going to try to be thoughtful. I'm going to offer my own personal experiences. I was in the United States military during the time of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I had a person who worked for me in the military who called me, said, hey, I need to talk to you. I knew exactly what he was going to tell me. I'm like, hey, before you tell me, I'm going to give you a couple of hours to think about it. Call me back. I know what you're going to tell me. And I'm not asking, you're not telling until you've thought about this. And then I go up there and he told me, hey, I'm gay. And the next thing I'm like, okay, well, you know what I have to do. I did not like the policy at all. I hated the policy because this is one of the best employees that I had. Best employees. So I did everything in my power to get him a job, and I helped get him a job. I think it was a hospital in Seattle. He called me. He would call me about once a year for a while after it all happened, and I didn't like it. That his usefulness in the military was determined by his sexual preference. I didn't like that. At the same time, there were people. So we were going to throw him out of the military because of his sexual preference, but yet there were men and women sleeping with each other, going to strip clubs, all kinds of immorality. But that was accepted and tolerated and okay. It was just this weird, like this form of sexual behavior is wrong, but this other actions are okay, and it's just like. It was just weird the way things were handled in the military in regards to that. So I've at least experienced it from that perspective. So I'm going to try to be thoughtful here. Here's what I ask you to do. Please hear me out. And I'm going to just stress this. I do believe emphatically that the Bible, first of all, marriage is between a man and a woman. If you want a biblical marriage, it's between a man and a woman. One man, one woman, for life, right? I don't believe the Bible supports divorce, and I believe if a person gets divorced and remarried, they're committing adultery. Now, how do you apply that in the church? I don't know. There's no really easy way to work that, but that's, I believe, is the biblical stance. I believe homosexuality is a sin. I believe it's a sin. I believe homosexuality is a sin. I believe adultery is a sin. I believe premarital sex is a sin. All right. So I believe the Bible gives a standard of how of sexuality, of a morality that applies to sexuality. I believe that Christians that we all fall short of that morality in all kinds of different ways. Remember, even if a man looks at a woman with lust, he is an adulterer. We all fall short of it. All right. So we got to be careful condemning homosexuality and not condemning our own failings. And our own failure. We all fall short when it comes to God's standard of sexuality. We fall short. And the reason we fall short because we're sinners, and that's why we have to be saved by grace alone through faith alone because of Christ alone, because we never will ever live up to what God calls us to live up. So I believe homosexuality is a sin. I believe that that we are created male and female, and that our genetic makeup demonstrates whether a person is a male or female. You can look at the chromosomes. You can know, hey, that's a male, that is a female. Yes, I do understand that things can happen because we live in a fallen world, that people can be born different ways that can create a lot of problems, but that's a very, 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 very small percentage. The normal person is born as a male or a female. That is their genetic makeup. If they do not identify with the biological sex that they were born as a male or a female, I think that that is a problem. I feel sorry for anyone who feels that way. I hate that, but you're still, like, you can, no matter what you do to your body, you're still going to be a man genetically, or you're still going to be a woman genetically, and you cannot change that. That is your genetic makeup. And that I think it's wrong to try to force everyone else in the world to go along with the way you identify, because you're now forcing everyone else to deny what reality is. And I think that is a problem. So I believe homosexuality is a sin. I believe sexual immorality is a sin. This is not about me denying what the Bible says, because I'm going to get all kinds of emails accusing me of that. This is me trying to figure out this very important concept. And I want to make sure I stress this at the very start. Here's a philosophy I am very, very, very much committed to. The Bible tells Christians how they are to live, and they tell us what is sin and what isn't sin. And that our job is to live in accordance with what the scriptures say. We are to go out, preach the gospel to the lost world, telling them to repent, that they are sinners, that they need to be saved, to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. And then after they become saved, we then teach them to obey all the things that God has commanded. I do not have any desire to run around trying to force the world to live like Christians. I have no desire to do that. I don't want to pass laws that try to force Christianity onto people. I do not want that. And here's the reason I don't want that. Forcing external morality on a lost person doesn't make them moral. It doesn't just fix them. So I don't want to impose Christianity on them. At the same time, I understand there has to be laws, right? There has to be laws. There has to be laws against murder. So all laws impose some level of morality on people. And I understand that those laws will not change the heart of people. Murder laws is not going to stop murder. I'm very aware of that. Speeding laws don't stop speeding. Laws against rape don't stop rape. But those laws are there to try to hold back wrong, and it gives then our judicial system the ability to punish and then imprison people for violating said wrong. And so we do need law to try to protect people. I'm not one of these people like, well, if the law doesn't work, throw out the law. Well, if you follow that argument, then we have no law. And if you don't want a law, that's not biblical in any way, shape, or form. Jesus even tells us to submit ourselves to earthly authority, and that they're there to punish evil and to do wrong. So the Bible would support civil law, and we should be thankful for civil law, trying to hold back evil and trying to give us a society that we can all live in, that we can pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that we can go after those things, that there are certain rights that are protected. We want a society that does its best to protect all of its citizens and give us the freedom to live out our lives. But there is a level where I don't want the church stepping in saying, hey, look, premarital sex is wrong. Any people who commit premarital sex, they need to be locked up and they need to be killed. Well, wait, really? So now you want capital punishment for premarital sex? Do you want capital punishment for adulterers? Do you want capital punishment for every man who looks at a woman and has lust in his heart? Do you want him to be killed for adultery? Do you want anytime a child talks back to his parents to be taken out back and stoned? I mean, there are lots of Old Testament laws that sometimes Christians want enforced, but those were civil laws for Israel. I don't want that. I think the Christian worldview is I'm going to preach the Christian morality. I'm going to try to live according to it. I'm going to fall short of it. That's why my salvation is by Christ alone. And when it comes to the society, I want there to be laws to try to protect us, to give us all the ability to live life, that we can, experience life, liberty, and that we can pursue happiness, that we have freedom, that we have some protections. And I want people to live their life with as much freedom as possible, They may use that freedom to sin. They may use that freedom to reject God, but I want them to have that freedom because I want that freedom. and I've said it so many times, the freedoms I deny others is the freedom that I ultimately deny myself. And I don't want to take other people's freedoms. And listen, the protections that I deny others is the very protections I am denying myself. Listen to that again. The freedoms I deny others is a freedom I'm ultimately denying myself. The protections I deny others is a protection I'm ultimately denying myself. And I've got to be very careful and be logical with that. Give you an example. A lot of Christians were upset because Netflix put the Last Temptation of Christ, that movie, on Netflix. And Christians were mad. They were calling for boycott it, boycott it, boycott it. Let's boycott Netflix. Well, then the other day I'm driving home and there's some movie put out by some Christian group that's going to come on Netflix soon. It's supposed to be a big deal. It's got some pretty big name actors in it. I don't know all the things about the movie, what it demonstrates, but it's supposed to be a Christian movie. It was on Christian radio. They're talking, we can't believe Netflix took this. And I'm like, wait a minute. It was like 2 months ago, 3 months ago, y'all were calling for banning, boycotting Netflix. Now you're saying support Netflix. So this is how Christians operate. Hey, they have movies we don't like. Boycott Netflix and force them to remove the movies we don't like. Oh, they're going to put a Christian movie. Yes, we love Netflix. Well, wait a minute. If you are going to tell them what movies they can play and try to shut them down when they play any movie that criticizes Christianity or mocks Christianity, then you are going to support them when they have a movie that promotes Christianity? So you want Netflix to be a Christian ministry? No. Netflix should be able to put whatever they want on their platform, and then you, as the viewer, can either decide to watch it or not watch it. And if you want a Christian movie, if you want them to have the freedom to put a Christian movie on there, then you should also allow them to have the freedom to put an atheistic movie on there. But Christians, sometimes we're going to, if an atheist group says we want all Christian movies removed from Netflix, or we're going to call for it to be boycotted until they go out of business, Christians would claim we're being persecuted. But we've done that with so many things. We want this, we're going to shut this down, boycott this because we don't like what they do. If you deny them freedom, you deny yourself freedom. If you deny them protection, you deny yourself protection. So I very much, I definitely like I like freedom, but I understand we have to have laws to offer some kind of protection. I want laws to protect a woman from being sexually harassed. I want laws to protect a woman from being raped. I want laws to protect children from being sexually abused. I want those laws. I know those laws are not going to change the heart of men and the heart of women, but I want them there to protect. Any argument that ultimately leads to a logical conclusion that there are to be no laws is a absolutely insane concept. And you can't maintain that, because the minute you throw out all laws, everyone does what is right in their own eyes. And we see what happens in the book of Judges. So I've got a pretty thought out perspective on this. And I know each issue requires thought to be balanced and to be logical. But those are some of the basic principles that I'm operating from, right? I believe the Bible has a view on sexual morality. I do, and I believe that, and I preach that. But look, I'm not going to call for some Old Testament law for killing people because they violate, the Old Testament civil law. Those were civil laws for Israel. I don't want those civil laws now. And trust me, you don't see Jesus calling for those civil laws to be reinstituted in the New Testament. He didn't tell his disciples, go forth and get civil law reestablished to fit the Old Testament. No, he said, submit to the authorities, even though those authorities were ungodly and pagan. Right? That's the key. Our job is to preach the gospel. Our job is to overcome evil with good. Our job is to preach the gospel and to fight these wars from a spiritual perspective, not an earthly perspective. But I do want laws out there to protect. Okay, I know I'm kind of stating that over and over and over again, but I want to make sure my position is clear. All right, so here we go. Let's go to the news as reported by NPR yesterday on All Things Considered, their news program that came on yesterday afternoon. I listened to it as a podcast. You should too, because it keeps you informed. But here we go.
2020 has already been a historic year, and today you can add another reason why. In a monumental decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the 1964 Civil Rights Act protects LGBTQ employees from discrimination based on sex. The vote was 6-3, as NPR legal affairs correspondent Nina Totenberg reports.
Justice Neil Gorsuch, President Trump's first appointee to the court, wrote the majority opinion, joined by Chief Justice John Roberts and the court's 4 liberal justices. Today, said Gorsuch, we must decide whether an employer can fire someone simply for being homosexual or transgender. The answer is clear. Such discrimination is barred by the language in the 1964 law that bans discrimination in employment based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. The decision is a huge victory for the LGBTQ community and a major loss for the Trump administration, which had sided with the employers in 3 cases before the court. 2 involved employees who sued, contending they'd been fired because they were gay. Gerald Bostock won awards for his work as the child welfare coordinator for Clayton County, Georgia. Then he joined a recreational softball league.
Within months, I was fired for being gay. I lost my livelihood. I lost my medical insurance, and I was recovering from prostate cancer when this occurred. It was devastating.
Amy Stevens, who'd worked for 6 years as a male funeral director in Livonia, Michigan, was fired 2 weeks after she told her boss that she was transgender and would be coming to work as a woman. She died earlier this year, but her case lived on, as did a 3rd case involving a now-deceased skydiving instructor who was gay. Justice Gorsuch couched his opinion today in terms of the text of the 1964 statute and its ban on discrimination because of sex. It is impossible to discriminate against a person for being homosexual or transgender without discriminating based on sex, he wrote. Justice Samuel Alito, in dissent, accused the majority of sailing under a textualist flag, essentially pretending to remain true to the words of the statute, but instead updating it to, quote, better reflect the current values of society. John Bursch, who represented the funeral home in the transgender firing case, agreed.
They followed the culture, not the law.
Gorsuch acknowledged that Congress in 1964 likely did not have the LGBTQ community in mind when it banned discrimination based on sex. But the words of the statute are clear, he said, and several major court rulings since then have read the law expansively. For instance, to bar discrimination against women because they have children, and to ban sexual harassment against both women and men. As Gorsuch put it when referring to the law, the limits of the drafter's imagination supply no reason to ignore the law's demands. At the end of his 33-page opinion, though, Gorsuch did invoke some potential caveats, and he pointed to the 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Act as a, quote, super statute that may offer a potential lifeline to employers who object on religious grounds to hiring gay and trans individuals. That said, today's ruling was remarkable in many respects. Nearly half the states have no legal protection for LGBTQ employees. Now the federal law will give that protection. Although LGBTQ advocates acknowledge there may well be legal bumps ahead, as Stanford law professor Pam Carlin puts it,
we didn't see really anybody other than the Conference of Catholic Bishops come in and make an argument that there are large numbers of employers who refuse as a blanket matter to hire people who are lesbian, who are gay, who are bisexual, or who are transgender.
Yale law professor William Eskridge, who's written extensively on this subject, agrees. He notes that the liberal Warren Court in the 1960s interpreted an immigration statute that barred psychopaths from entering the country to apply to all homosexuals.
LGBT people have come a long way in the last generation. The country has come a long way in the last generation. And the Supreme Court has come a long way in the last generation.
And Evan Wolfson, founder of Freedom to Marry, had this to say.
One big lesson from this opinion is don't give up. You have to believe that you can change things.
Nina Totenberg, NPR News, Washington.
All right. There is a lot there to unpack. There really is. Now, we have first, so let's just try to break this down. First, we have the whole legal decision. And was the legal decision, as they even said, they weren't following the law, they were following the culture. Okay. Now we could argue, therefore, that's messed up, that's wrong, shouldn't do that. Okay. We could have, that's a whole legal interpretive battle, and we will discuss that at some length. Or at least we'll listen to someone else discuss it at some length. Let's set that aside. Let's just take this down right to the very basic. Because again, yesterday when I had a conversation, I was kind of shocked that this would be a possible way of thinking among some people. I would think that the majority of people listening to me agree that you don't want an employer to discriminate against people. Let's go with something basic on the basis of race. Hey, you come in to get a job, you apply for a job. I'm sorry, we don't hire African Americans. I'm sorry, we don't hire people who are of Spanish descent, who are Asian. No, we only hire whites. That's all we're going to do. We're only going to hire white people. All right. Now, I think most would say that's messed up. Now, again, the argument that I had yesterday is there shouldn't be any law that governs it in any way, shape, or form. Well, man, the whole civil rights without the civil rights movement is the thing that helped bring these protections in. If you do that, if you get a majority, if you get a majority of people to ban a certain race or a certain group from getting a job, you literally then force that race into being a second class of citizen. They can't get the good jobs. How far do you take that? Should education be forced? I mean, should a hospital be forced to treat people of all races? There's got to be some laws to protect people. I can't imagine a world where someone would argue no laws of protection. Discrimination can reign. Well, that's insane. I don't want to live in a world that way. And again, think about it. We're living in a post-Christian world. All right. At what point do you want to say, hey, are you a Christian? Sorry, we don't hire Christians. How about businesses? Do you want laws to protect businesses from? Sir, ma'am, are you a Christian? I'm sorry, you can't eat here. We don't allow Christians to eat here. We don't allow Christians to shop here. We don't allow Christians to bank here. I mean, do you really want that in a society? I can't imagine anyone would argue against discrimination laws as being wrong because a private business should be able to do whatever they want. Look, man, that is a frightening thought from my perspective. So I think we can all agree to some level that we need certain laws to protect that people cannot be discriminated against on the basis of, we'll go through these, on the basis of race, on the basis of sex. This is where the current issue is. Sex, and typically the way that was interpreted is you can't discriminate. You can't fire a woman for being a woman. You can't refuse to hire a woman because she's a woman. All right, so you can't discriminate on the basis of race. You can't discriminate on the basis of sex, and then typically it's also included. You cannot discriminate on the basis of religion, and Christians love that one, right? We don't want, as a Christian, I don't want to be discriminated against in the workplace and fired because I'm a Christian, or not be able to get a job because I'm a Christian. You don't want that. You want employers to be forced to hire the best person for the job, regardless of race, sex, or religion. That seems like a pretty equal, just way of doing things. To argue that we don't want any of those laws and we just want it to be the wild, wild west and everyone can discriminate. Now, the way that argument is look, that business discriminates. You can go get a job somewhere else, or you can go get your food somewhere else, and that the free market will ultimately fix the problem, that the businesses that do that will ultimately go out of business, and that will be the end. Well, if there's a major societal change, maybe that won't happen. Maybe the society will decide that, I don't know, all the Jews shouldn't be able to buy food, and all the Jews, we don't want that. I don't believe in the goodness. I do not believe that man is basically good. I believe men are totally depraved, and you have to have laws to protect that depravity from treating and hurting other people. You have to have something there. Now, it's not going to fix the heart, but it's to try to protect and push back and hold it back so that depravity cannot be seen, and policies that hurt people. So I think we can all agree there. Now, here comes the issue. All right. Should an employer, now this is just, I'm going to put this at the basic level. Should an employer be able to refuse to hire someone, all right, because they are a homosexual, be able to fire someone once they find out that they're a homosexual? Now, a lot of Christians will argue, yes, they should, because homosexuality is wrong. You've got to take this to its logical conclusion. Wait a minute. So what if you find out that one of your employees goes to the strip club on a regular basis? Isn't that wrong? Should they be fired? I mean, if you're going to fire the homosexual, aren't you going to fire the guy who goes to the strip club when he should be at home taking care of his family? What if you find out that there's a guy who watches porn all the time? Should he be fired? I mean, you're going to fire the homosexual. Hey, what if you hire a teenager for the summer? You find out that your teenager is sleeping with their boyfriend or girlfriend. That's premarital sex. You're going to fire them? Oh, wait. Are you going to, you've got people who are, sir, you want this job? I need to ask you, are you married? Yes. Were you married before? Well, yes, I was married. I got divorced. And I got remarried. Oh, you're an adulterer. Sorry, can't hire you. Like, once you start trying to say that you're going to hire and fire people off a basis of some sexual morality, where do you draw the line? It's always weird. Homosexuality, we got to fire them. They can't be here. But all the other sexual immorality is acceptable? Like, I'll never understand that. It's the same thing with the whole, I am not going to make a cake for a gay wedding, but I got no problem making a cake for someone who's married, divorced, and now he's getting remarried, which means they're committing adultery. But hey, that's okay. That's okay. It's always this weird, like, hey, I'm willing to make a cake for someone who lived together for 6 years and, was, living in sin for 6 years and committed premarital sex. I'm okay to make the cake for them. Like it's weird, like where Christians draw the line morally. I think when we start running our businesses where we're going to hire and fire people on the basis of this, it becomes insane. It becomes very difficult in how that works. Now, so I think on the basic level, I'm for laws to protect people so they cannot be discriminated against, because I don't want to be discriminated against. I don't want to lose a job because I'm a Christian. I don't want to be refused to get a job because I'm a Christian. I don't want that. I want all people to have equal ability to apply for a job. Now, at the same time, I am not for laws that say you have to hire so many women and so many African Americans or so many Asians. I don't like that either. I want employers that everyone has an equal opportunity to apply, and that hopefully the employer will do their best to hire the most qualified people. I don't want a quota system. I don't like that. I don't think that that's right. I want them to hire the most qualified applicant. And I don't want a person to be fired because they're a race or because their sexuality or anything else. I want some kind of an equal system. I think no system is going to be perfect. Let's make that very clear, because no law can fix the inherent biases, prejudices, and bigotry inside the human heart. It can't. And you can't expect a law to do that. The law is to try to hold back the external exercise of that depravity. It can't change the heart, but it's supposed to keep it in check. And we need the law to keep depravity in check, or we end up in chaos, and then we end up in the book of Judges. So let's keep that in mind right there. So at the very basic level, hey, you can't fire someone because they're gay. You can't refuse to hire someone because they're gay. I don't know why that's so controversial. I guess if I say that, Christians are like, you're supporting homosexuality. No, I'm not. I believe homosexuality is a sin. I believe homosexuality is a sin. I'm the person who worked for me in the military. We had extensive debates at work because we worked at night in the medical records section where we filed paperwork, and that's all we did. And we got to have great conversations. Now, I would always say, hey, now, don't get offended here. Let's make sure, we're going to have a difference of opinion, because I didn't want, the workplace to become a place of hostility, but a place of, hey, we can express opinions and have great debates. And we always did so, and we got along, even though we disagreed strongly. And I would state, from a biblical perspective, I believe homosexuality is a sin. But I also believe looking at a woman with lust is a sin. I also believe premarital sex is a sin. I believe there's lots of sexual sins. So, but I had no problem working with the person. Had no problem at all. No problem. Great worker. Did the job perfectly. Better than a lot of the other people. And if I was going to condemn his homosexuality, I had people who I worked with who were involved in all kinds of sexual sins going on. All right. So there was drunkenness, there was strip clubs, you name it. There was pornography. There was all kinds of other things going on. So if I was going to condemn I wasn't going to put his homosexuality above all the other immoralities that were happening around me. But I had no problem expressing it to him when asked and was given the ability to engage in a rational conversation that did not create a hostile workplace. Had to be very careful how I did that. But when we had those conversations, but we always got along because I always made it very clear that I believe other sexual actions are wrong. So I just think that there's got to be I don't understand why this is so crazy controversial. I understand that there's some legal issues there. Like, wait a minute, they didn't follow the law. They followed the culture. That's a little disturbing. Do we want the Supreme Court to follow culture or to follow the law? That's a little troubling. And on that aspect, I have some issues. But I guess there's one other aspect here we need to consider. All right, a Christian, should there be a religious exception, a religious protection here? That on religious grounds, so in other words, can a business on religious grounds then be allowed to discriminate? Now, we got to think about what we mean by this. Now, if we're referring to a ministry, right? Like you are a Christian school, you are a church, you have a Christian ministry. Well, in those cases, then obviously the people you're going to be hiring have to be professing Christians who have to be living in accordance to a biblical morality. So I think that there has to be religious protections for that. Now, here becomes the issue. You are religious and you own a coffee shop. Now that's not a ministry, that's a business. It's a business. I think there's a big difference between a ministry and a business, and this is why I've been saying this for years. This is why ministries cannot operate as businesses. If you're going to operate as a ministry, operate as a ministry. You can't be like, we're a ministry, but we also are a business. Well, that gets you in trouble. Like a church who says, we're a ministry, but we're going to rent out our building for weddings and then next thing you know, say gay people can't use our church building. Well, okay, wait a minute. You're using your church as a business. That's not a ministry. You're charging and renting out your property as a business. That's not a ministry. Operate as a ministry and don't let anyone use your building for weddings. Only people you marry are people who are members of your church. End of story. Then you're protected. If you're going to rent it out, then you're going to be held to business law. And I think that's the way it should operate. I think that's crazy. And again, when it comes to churches doing that, I'm not going to rent out this building for a gay wedding, but I got no problem renting out this building for people who are not Christians, renting out this building for people who are divorced and getting remarried, so therefore they're entering into an adulterous relationship. I got no problem doing that, but hey, those gay people can't use it. Like sometimes we're not even consistent in the way we apply biblical morality. So I think that there's got to be a distinction there. A Christian school should only be hiring Christian teachers, right? If that's the whole goal, to give people a Christian education, and therefore they should be hiring people there, and there should be a possible moral clause that, hey, if you're involved in certain behavior, this is how we're going to handle moral failings and moral violations of a code. That's again operating more like a ministry. That's operating as ministry. But a business, how far? Like, can a Christian, you say, well, a Christian business owner shouldn't have to hire a homosexual. Should a Christian business owner be allowed to only hire people who agree with their doctrinal stance? Like, I'm a Protestant, we're not hiring Catholics. I'm a Protestant, and I'm a Baptist, so I'm not going to hire any Presbyterians. I'm not going to hire any Lutherans. Your hiring practice is going to be based off theology as well? Oh, I have an employee, they were a Baptist, but now they're a Presbyterian. I'm sorry, I got to fire you. Like how far do we, if you're going to want a religious exception, how far do you take it? And again, this has to apply to all religions. Muslim, if you're going to apply for some kind of discrimination and give a religious exception, then you got to do so for the Muslim business owner who can say, I'm not going to hire any Christians. I'm not going to serve any Christians. Like, how far do you take this kind of thing? How far do you take it? So I think ministries have to be protected. Absolutely. I mean, as a church, I should be able to only hire Christians, right? I should only be able to hire Christians for the work of ministry. Now, if I'm going to hire someone to work on, I mean, we had people come and repair our air conditioning. I didn't stop and go, I need to know if you're a Christian, right? If I hire someone to do cleaning of the church, I shouldn't I would hope I would never even consider like worrying about their sexuality or anything else. I'm hiring them to do a job around the church. So, but for hiring them for the work that's involved in ministry, yeah, there's got to be some protections there. There has to be some. So how do we draw that line becomes very, very difficult. But many are acting like, that a Christian businessman should just be able to like, nope, not hiring a homosexual, not going to hire a transgender. And I just like, I don't get that. You're a business. You're not a ministry. And you're like, well, I'm going to operate my business as a ministry. Then make it a ministry and don't follow. Then operate it as a ministry. Don't charge any money. Don't do it for profit. You just do donations and then operate it as a ministry. Connect it to a church. Make it your coffee house you're opening. You're going to operate it as a ministry. Then connect it to being a ministry of the church you attend. It's an extension of your church's ministry, and then operate it that way. There's got to be a way to work that out. So, yeah, I did not see this as necessarily as the end of the world. I thought, I think homosexuals and transgenders should be protected. There should be some protection. Now, the law that was used to come to the conclusion, was that a legally, constitutionally sound decision, or did they go beyond the actual meaning? In other words, should a new law have to have been suggested and then go through the process of that law turning, passing all of the requirements in our political structure so that it could be made a law, and then that law be federally enforced on all states? Or should it be up to each state and how to enforce discrimination laws, federal government, state? We could get into a lot of discussions there. So there's a lot of legal issues here, and constitutional, and how laws are to be interpreted and how to be applied that could be argued here. But just from a Christian perspective, I think people deserve protection. And I don't, how does that make me not a Christian? I don't know. Let's listen to how Albert Mohler handled this. All right, here's from his program.
It's Tuesday, June 16, 2020. I'm Albert Mohler, and this is The Briefing, a daily analysis of news and events from a Christian worldview. On Monday's edition of The Briefing, I concluded by talking about the fact that so many of our culture's most contentious issues end up before some court, and eventually often before the Supreme Court of the United States. I did not intend to be a prophet, but the very next morning, the Supreme Court of the United States made that point emphatically by handing down a decision in bundled cases. The lead case was known as Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, in which a majority of the Supreme Court decided that civil rights protections going back to 1964 against sex discrimination now apply to LGBTQ persons, and in particular to gay and transgender persons. It's a stunning decision, not so much stunning in the fact that the Supreme Court addressed the issue. We knew the court had taken the case, and oral arguments were heard in the closing months of 2019. We knew that a decision was coming before the court broke for its summer recess. We knew what had been at stake in the oral arguments. But very few people could have foreseen that this would be a 6-3 decision, with the liberal justices of the Supreme Court joined by 2 justices, often categorized as conservative, appointed by Republican presidents. That would include the Chief Justice of the United States, John G. Roberts Jr., appointed to that post by President George W. Bush, and Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch, appointed to the Supreme Court by President Donald Trump. And it was Gorsuch, indeed, who ended up writing the majority opinion, the decision for the entire court. Observers looking at the case may argue over this point or that, but they cannot deny that this case has massive precedential effect. That is to say, it establishes a precedent. Now, putting that in context, this was not a decision over the Constitution of the United States as the governing text. That was in the background. This was a case that had to do with statutory law, and the statute that was in question is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and what is known as Title VII of that act. And that is the section of the law that bans discrimination on the basis of sex or sex discrimination. Now, as was obvious, and as even the majority of the court had to recognize, if you go back to 1964, it is not imaginable that anyone had in mind the LGBTQ revolution. Indeed, everyone would have had in mind that sex in this case refers entirely to a biological reality definable as male or female. We'll be looking further at this because, in many ways, it is the central issue in this case. The fact that sex means male or female, that it meant such in 1964, and as most of the justices recognized in most cases, it still means exactly the same thing today. Nonetheless, 6 justices of the nation's highest court proceeded to legislate from the bench that the 1964 Act is now to be evaluated as including transgender and same-sex orientation as protected classes. They admit that wasn't what was intended in 1964, but nonetheless, that is what the Act must be interpreted to mean now. And the complications of that, the implications of the precedent are absolutely massive. It's going to be interesting, by the way, to see how many attorneys, including some identified with evangelical or conservative Christianity, argue against the fact that this decision will have a massive impact as precedent. But understand why they're going to be making that argument. It is because they expect to be back in court very soon, making the argument that this case should not prevail in every engaging issue thereafter. But as we're going to see, Justice Samuel Alito, in a scathing dissent, understood exactly what is at stake. Gorsuch, writing for the majority, said this, quote, "We agree that homosexuality and transgender status are distinct concepts from sex. But as we've seen, discrimination based on homosexuality or transgender status necessarily entails discrimination based on sex. The first cannot happen without the second," end quote. Now, what kind of sense does that make? Let's just try to understand those words in the English language and try to figure out what sense is implied. Difficult as it is, let's look at the inner thinking of the majority of the Supreme Court as now demonstrated in this lamentable precedent. Here's what they decided. If you are a man in love with a man and you suffer discrimination for being romantically involved with a man, romantically or sexually, or perhaps even marrying a man, insofar as same-sex marriage is now declared to be legal, if you are a man that has a relationship with a man and you lose your job or some other benefit for it, a woman in love with a man would not have lost the same opportunity. Therefore, it is discrimination on the basis of sex. Now, again, wait just a minute. You're saying that it's not on the basis of sex as to whether or not the man is a man or the woman is a woman, but rather the fact that now we are told that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, read through Title VII of that act, means that what wasn't even on the mind of the legislators who adopted the act, nor the President of the United States who signed it into law, that is now the prevailing doctrine of the Supreme Court of the United States. And we're being told that the word sex actually in this context means sex, the majority says, at least in terms of something meant by those legal authorities and political leaders in 1964. Because, again, if a woman loves a man, she is not punished for it. But if a man loves a man, he is. Therefore, it's sex discrimination. That's absolute nonsense, but it is now the prevailing doctrine of the Supreme Court of the United States, and it's going to have vast implications. Almost immediately, we recognize that this throws wide open the gates to a continual flood of litigation in which cases are made that any policy undertaken by a Christian college or a university or an employer or a church, you just go down the list, private Christians engaged in business. Now you're going to see that all of these issues become the focus of litigation, with those who are pushing for the sexual revolution pointing to this case and saying, yes, look, they just declared that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 includes gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender, all of those relationships and activities and lifestyles, you name it, all those orientations. It's all included. So you have Justice Alito pointing out that this could quickly mean the elimination eventually of women's sports in the high schools, in colleges who participate in Title IV funding. You could go down the list.
Okay, now he's making some good legal arguments. So I want to make sure you understand. On one hand, this is about discrimination, and I don't want anyone to be discriminated against. But now there is the legal ramification. What was this decision based off of? And it seems like, again, even the NPR clip acknowledged this is not based off law. It was based off society. And now when you get into, hey, so if I am a transgender, and I'm a man, but I now identify as a woman and I want to play in women's sports, if you don't let me, that's discrimination. Now that's where this becomes, now this takes on a whole different level, right? Because now the issue is, wait a minute. No, you're actually biologically a male. And if you compete against the women, you're going to have an unfair advantage. And this is not good. And we've seen this happen in a number of situations where you have a man who identifies as a woman, goes and compete against the women and destroys them in track and I think in wrestling and some other examples. Yeah, that and they're going to use this as the argument to prove that. Now, this does open up a legal can of worms that is going to end up being right back in the court. Now, this is problematic. This is problematic because now we've got to get into how do we define what a man is and how do we define what a woman is. Now, this opens a different door because now, hey, I identify as a woman. You can't discriminate against me. So now I can do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, because if you don't, you're discriminating against me. Now, this is a separate problem. All right. This is a separate problem that is difficult. So, for example, if you have a job, man, I'm trying to think of all the possible legal issues here. If you have I'm trying to think of some different ways that this would work. Clearly in the sports situation, this could be in college sports and high school sports. This could be a major problem because if you identify as a woman, and then if I say, wait a minute, you're not a woman, you're a man, therefore you can't play this sport, you can't do this, and now we can use this law as you're discriminating against me. Yeah, that does open up a different issue. The transgender aspect of this definitely opens up a problem. And I think our society, I think we're definitely going to see further ramifications to this. So we got two separate issues here. Like if I have a job, if I have a place of business and you come to me and you're transgender, I'm not going to hire you just because I don't like transgender. I want that person who's a transgender to have some form of protection. But if that transgender is in a situation where, hey, you're actually a man but you're claiming to be a woman, and no, you can't participate in this because this is for women only or for men only, and no, you're not what you claim to be. Yeah, that's a whole different subject. So we got three issues here. We got three issues to try to work through. Number one, the legal argument used here seems to be very broken, that they took a law that never would have included this, and then they didn't follow the law. They followed where we are as a society and then interpreted this that way and gave a ruling based off that. So there seems to be a major legal issue in how this came to pass. That's number one. Number two, it does seem to afford protection so that people cannot be discriminated against. And on that level, it's a good thing. On that level, it's a good. I don't want anyone to be discriminated against. Again, what is my philosophy? If I'm going to not protect you from being discriminated, then I'm not protecting myself from being discriminated. I want there to be freedom And I don't want people to be discriminated against. The freedoms I take from you are the freedoms I take from me. The protections I take away from you are the protections I take away from me. So on that level, I'm okay. The third thing, though, this seems to open up the door for some weird things as it relates to transgender. And so we're going to have to some point where, I hate to say this, we've reached a point in our society that I don't know if we can ever go back to simply defining a man as a man and a woman as a woman based off their genetic makeup. I think we've reached a point where society is now going to define a male and a female based off how a person self-identifies. And that is going to throw our world into all kinds of chaos, especially in the sporting world. And there could be other consequences as well, where this could have great consequences beyond that. So I'm glad he brought that up, because that's an area I wasn't thinking about. I'm just looking at it from the discrimination standpoint. So 3 areas. The legal argument seems weird. 2, discrimination. I'm all for protecting people from being discriminated against. Okay. And then 3, the transgender issue on, hey, I identify, I'm going into the girls' shower. You can't go into the girls' shower. It's for females. Don't discriminate against me because I identify as a woman. Yeah, that's and I don't know exactly how this is going to work, and I don't know if what he's warning here is going to come to pass, but that's something we really have to think about, all right? There's a lot of different layers here to work our way through. All right, let's continue.
One of the big questions is, after this, can you have restroom facilities or locker rooms that are designated by sex or gender, as we say these days? The issue is, if the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, is now read that any kind of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, including transgender identity, is illegal discrimination, then how can any of these things stand? Furthermore, we as Christians have to understand that this is a head-on collision when it comes to religious liberty and the sexual revolution, and in this case, it is aided and abetted, indeed even accelerated, by the 6-justice majority of the U.S. Supreme Court, with none other than the Trump-appointed Justice Neil Gorsuch writing the majority opinion. Before leaving the majority opinion, I want to point out that in effect, it just takes the Equality Act, which was brought forward before the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives. It could not have possibly gotten through the United States Senate, but nonetheless, it's effectively now the law of the land by edict of the Supreme Court of the United States. This is exactly what the federal courts are not to do. They are not to usurp the entire political process, but that is what they have done. And once again, the liberal progressives in this culture who have pressed for abortion rights, and you just go down the list, the legalization of same-sex marriage, they have won in the courts what they could not win through the legitimate legislative process. And thus they went to the courts, and the courts will be long remembered in the course of American history, however long that history may last, as the eventual engines of loosening this country from its constitutional sanity and from the separation of the 3 branches of government, basically eroding the entire constitutional structure of the United States. And conservatives in this country had believed that we were making headway on these issues by electing conservative presidents who would appoint conservative judges and justices. And by the way, that argument is not destroyed by the decision that was written by Neil Gorsuch yesterday and joined by the Chief Justice, but it is significantly weakened. It reminds us that on the left, liberals operate on the basis of an ideology. That's a part of what makes the left, in the modern sense, the left. It has an ideology. It has a ticker of issues. But when it comes to conservatism, it is more a disposition or a set of principles. And furthermore, there's more to this issue. As you think about the Supreme Court of the United States or the role of the court,
Now, I have to jump in here. I think the people on the right are ideologically driven. I think people on the left are ideologically driven. I think our whole culture is ideologically driven. I think Christians are the ones who are not to be ideologically driven. We're to be theologically and biblically driven. All right. So I don't like when it turns into this, like, the left, they're all ideologically driven, but hey, conservatives, we have principles. Yeah, I think liberals have principles too. It's just the principles we disagree with. All right. So Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that. Okay, but let's let him finish.
Conservatives have argued, along with the founders of this nation for decades, that we should not be looking for outcome-based law. That is to say, conservatives operating by conservative principles are not supposed to seek judges and justices who will rule a certain way on a certain question, but rather will have a just understanding of the Constitution and commitments to our constitutional order and an understanding of how a text like the Constitution or law is to be read, which would eventually produce conservative results precisely because they would take away the court's power to operate without regard for the text. In one of the most reckless portions of the majority opinion written by Justice Gorsuch, he writes this, quote, "If anything, the employer's new framing may only add new problems." Now, the employers in this case were arguing against the fact that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 included sexual orientation in rendering illegal sexual discrimination. But then Gorsuch writes, quote, "The employers assert that no one in 1964 or for some time after would have anticipated today's result. But is that really true?" Gorsuch asked. "Not long after the law's passage, gay and transgender employees began filing Title VII complaints, so at least some people foresaw this potential application." End quote. But yes, guess what, Justice Gorsuch? Those claims were considered absolutely wrong and illegitimate and were turned back both by the legislature and by the courts. Trying to be cute, he entangles himself in his own culpability for very flawed legal logic. Justice Alito, writing a dissent that was joined by Justice Clarence Thomas, wrote, quote, "There is only one word for what the court has done today: legislation. The document that the court releases is in the form of a judicial opinion interpreting a statute, but that is deceptive," he says. "Look at it. It is legislation." He goes on to say, quote, "Neither sexual orientation nor gender identity appears on that list," that is, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Quote, "For the past 45 years, bills have been introduced in Congress to add sexual orientation to the list, and in recent years, bills have included gender identity as well. But to date, none has passed both houses," end quote. Justice Alito says this, quote, "Many will applaud today's decision because they agree on policy grounds with the court's updating of Title VII. But the question in these cases is not whether discrimination because of sexual orientation or gender identity should be outlawed. The question is whether Congress did that in 1964. It indisputably did not," end quote. Now, the big warning that Justice Alito, joined by Justice Thomas, and later in a separate dissent, Justice Kavanaugh, made many of the same points. The central issue here is that the judiciary in general, and the Supreme Court specifically, is not charged in our Constitution to make law nor to correct law. It is assigned the responsibility to rule according to the Constitution of the United States and the statute. It is not to extend the logic of laws. It is not to do what Congress profoundly has been unwilling to do. Justice Alito later writes, quote, "If sex in Title VII means biologically male or female, then discrimination because of sex means discrimination because the person in question is biologically male or biologically female, not because that person is sexually attracted to members of the same sex or identifies as a member of a particular gender," end quote. Profoundly true, explicitly true, self-evidently true, but denied by the 6-person majority of the Supreme Court. Justice Alito makes another very important historical point. If you go back to 1964, if you make the claim that sexual orientation, including the array now identified, not then, of course, but now identified as LGBTQ, the argument that somehow sexual orientation or same-sex orientation was to be included in that list of protected categories is undercut by a very simple fact ignored by the majority of the court. In most states at that time, such sexual activities were actually illegal. Justice Alito got right to the religious liberty issue when he wrote, quote, The position that the court now adopts will threaten freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and personal privacy and safety. No one, said Justice Alito, should think that the court's decision represents an unalloyed victory for individual liberty. Justice Alito then outlined some of what he called the potential consequences of the court's decision, but let's recognize these really aren't potential, at least in terms of claims that will be made in court against many employers, including Christian employers. Amongst these issues are bathrooms, locker rooms, and other things of that kind. Quote, the court may wish to avoid this subject, but it is a matter of concern to many people who are reticent about disrobing or using toilet facilities in the presence of individuals whom they regard as members of the opposite sex. Justice Alito then said, under the court's decision, however, transgender persons will be able to argue that they are entitled to use a bathroom or locker room that is reserved for persons of the sex with which they identify, and while the court does not define what it means by a transgender person, the term may apply to individuals who are gender fluid, that is, individuals whose gender identity is mixed or changes over time. Thus, he says, a person who has not undertaken any physical transitioning may claim the right to use the bathroom or locker room assigned to the sex with which the individual identifies at that particular time, end quote. He goes on to talk about the complexities of this issue when it comes to education, elementary education, secondary education, and college and university education, especially for any of those schools that take any federal funds. That includes all the public schools at every level, public colleges and universities. It also includes the vast majority of private institutions who come under Title IX precisely because they participate in federal student loan and aid programs. And almost directly, Justice Alito then goes to the issue of women's sports, writing, quote, another issue that may come up under both Title VII and Title IX is the right of a transgender individual to participate on a sports team or in an athletic competition previously reserved for members of one biological sex. He says the issue is already coming up under Title IX. Given the court's majority opinion yesterday, it's going to come up under Title VII. He goes on from there to talk about challenges to housing and employment by religious organizations. He even goes so far as to say that the right of religious institutions, churches, and schools even to hire teachers consistent with the organization's convictions is now very much in question. Once again, people may tell you this is not a big decision. Understand, we're going to be looking back for the rest of our lives to this decision handed down on June the 15th of 2020. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, in a separate dissent, wrote, quote, many Americans will not buy the novel interpretation unearthed and advanced by the court today. Many will no doubt believe that the court has unilaterally rewritten American vocabulary and American law. A, quote, statutory amendment courtesy of unelected judges, end quote. But I want to look at one further issue of the majority's opinion that is particularly troubling and enormously revealing. The majority argues that, yes, it's true that the word sex in 1964 didn't mean what they argue that it means now. Yes, they concede sexual orientation wasn't included, and nor was the transgender identity, nor was that even imaginable. Yes, they say, but nonetheless, when you are talking about a transgender person or you're talking about a homosexual person, it is still an issue of sex discrimination. They're holding to that. 6-3 in this case. But at this point, I would just like to introduce Justice Neil Gorsuch of the Supreme Court of the United States to Justice Neil Gorsuch of the Supreme Court of the United States, who in 2016, in an address to an audience at Case Western Reserve University, said that the key issue for federal judges is understanding that they are to look backward, not so much to the present nor to the future. He says the legislature looks forward. It adopts laws that are going to bind the people of the United States for years to come. Judges, he says, or he said then, are not to do that. They are to look backward. The entire judiciary, he says, is to look backward. Now, let's just remind ourselves, looking backward in time means, history. Yes, so history is important. The majority said yesterday the history is not so important, but Justice Gorsuch said in 2016 that it is. Instead, he wrote this, quote, judges should instead strive, if humanly and so imperfectly, to apply the law as it is, focusing backward, not forward, and looking to the text, structure, and history to decide what a reasonable reader at the time of the events in question would have understood the law to be. He continued, quote, not to decide cases based on their own moral convictions or the policy consequences they believe might serve society best, end quote. Again, notice what he said. He said that laws are rightly to be interpreted as would be commonly understood by a reasonable reader at the time of the events in question. That time would be 1964. That time might reasonably be extended even into the early 1970s as you're looking at revisions to the law. But there is no way to reconcile what the court did yesterday in the majority opinion written by Neil Gorsuch with what the very same justice told us is his understanding of how the court and a judge or justice is to interpret the law. Again, he said this, the judge and the court are to look to the law as it is, focusing backward, not forward. And he went on to say, looking to text, structure, and history to decide what a reasonable reader at the time of the events in question would have understood the law to be, end quote. I repeat that sentence simply to make the point. Justice Gorsuch was profoundly right in that address in 2016. He is profoundly wrong, along with 5 other of his colleagues, in the decision that was handed down yesterday. And not just wrong, but dangerously wrong because of the impact that this precedent will establish. Furthermore, it sends a very clear signal that even when you have conservative justices who are supposedly operating out of an originalist or strict constructionist or textualist interpretation, they don't always act consistently. But this raises another issue of massive significance. Back at the end of 2019, when the oral arguments for these cases were heard before the court, there were those then, and I was one of those, who recognized that there was a play being made to Justice Gorsuch and to his form of textualism to try to draw him into this argument. The editorial board of the Wall Street Journal on November the 21st of 2019 wrote, quote, enter Justice Elena Kagan, bearing a different definition of the text of the statute, updated for current mores. And the editors continued, quote, during oral arguments, she sought to redefine sex in Title VII to mean more than the binary choice of a man or woman. And later they wrote, quote, Justice Kagan is a shrewd court politician, and her goal in politically significant cases is to attract one of the conservative justices to form a 5-4 liberal majority. She succeeded more than once, they wrote, with Chief Justice John Roberts, who's above all an institutionalist who wants to preserve the court's public standing. But the editors then wrote this, quote, her main target on the Title VII cases is Justice Gorsuch. And sure enough, in oral arguments, he suggested that he might agree with Justice Kagan's nouveau interpretation of sex. At one point, he said, the textual evidence is really close, and we're not talking about extra textual stuff, end quote. So Justice Gorsuch tipped his hand back in November of 2019, prodded by Justice Elena Kagan. The editors wrote back at the end of 2019 that if this is what textualism means, then textualism can become just another name for a progressivist interpretation of the Constitution. So as we come to a close, recognize that those terms are not exactly the same. Originalist, strict constructionist, and textualist. All of those are used by conservatives as discussing how the Constitution of the United States is to be interpreted. Justice Gorsuch's understanding of textualists in this case is a rather dangerous understanding, and it flies in the face of the justice he replaced on the Supreme Court, Justice Antonin Scalia. Scalia said that textualism means that the words are to be read as they would have been understood by, quote, reasonable people at the time, end quote. As Justice Alito explains, quote, textualists do not read statutes as if they were messages picked up by a powerful radio telescope from a distant and utterly unknown civilization, end quote. And this reminds Christians, as we think not only about the Constitution and law, but as we think about the far higher responsibility to read and to understand the Bible as God's Word, this is why evangelicals come down to the historical grammatical method of interpretation. That's a form of textualism. But notice, the word history there is important. We want to understand the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, every single text, the way a reader would have understood that text from the beginning, from the point of the Holy Spirit inspiring the author until the point at which the first audience would have read it or heard it or received it. Yes, we pay attention to the grammar. That's why we call it historical grammatical interpretation. But grammar alone is not enough, as if the text were written in 2020. No, it's historical grammatical and for very important reasons consistent with the nature of Scripture as the inspired and inerrant Word of God. Now, the Constitution and laws of the United States of America are not inspired or inerrant, but they are the Constitution and the statutes and the laws of this nation. And they, too, must be interpreted, yes, in terms of the words, the sentences, and the propositions, but yes, also in terms of the history in which those words were written. What did they mean to a reasonable person at that time? Here's the bottom line. If you are now going to insist they mean something different, it is you and not they who are being unreasonable, and dangerously so. Thanks for listening to The Briefing.
All right, there is a lot to unpack in all of this. So here's what we're going to do. We are already well over an hour. This went a lot longer than I went, and I know I did a lot of discussing and trying to process all of this, but I'm trying to be thoughtful here. I'm not trying to come at this just like, I think there's a lot of there's nuance here. There's layers here that we have to unpack. So let me do my best to summarize. What I always try to do in my teaching is take complicated issues and break them down so that everyone can get them. So let me make this very simple. We have a couple of issues here. Number one, we have the legal issue and how this legal decision came about, And there are some major questions on how it came about, that they did not follow the law, that they followed culture, and they took the law and tried to apply this to the culture today, and they legislated. They didn't just simply interpret the law. They almost legislated their own ideas. And this is problematic, and it could be problematic moving forward. Now, we can condemn it all day, but it's been done. There's no going back. This is the way they've opened the door, and now we're going to have to deal with it. So let's just acknowledge that. We can condemn this possibly on the legal way this took place and the way the court conducted itself. There seems to be a very strong ground for saying, hey, they did not handle this right. They did not follow the law. They legislated. They did not interpret the law. And this is a problem. But that's done. There's no going back. And this is probably going to open the door with the way the court may move forward on other key issues in the future. So we have to be prepared for that. So that's number one, the legal issues and how the court conducted itself. Number two, we still have the fundamental principle here of discrimination. We all want certain laws to protect people from being discriminated against. I would think if you don't want any laws against discrimination, then it's just chaos. And no, you can't, and you can't make an argument, well, discrimination laws won't change racism, so we should get rid of them. Well, murder laws don't get rid of murder, so we should get rid of murder law. Like that, when people make those kinds of arguments, they're not even taking it to its logical conclusion. You're making an argument against all law. Law is not to change the hearts of people. Law is to try to hold back the hearts of people from acting out in an external way. It can't change the internal heart, but it can keep the internal heart from acting out in an inappropriate way externally. And there's a certain framework that we want to have to give people protections. All right. So keep that in mind. I am all for people not being discriminated against, but there is a third issue here that is really, really big, and this is the issue our society is ultimately going to have to come down. Society is going to have to finally define this. I don't know if it's going to have to be defined in the Supreme Court. I don't know if it's going to have to be politics, but our society is going to have to make a very important definition. Is what makes a man and what makes a woman? Is it their genetic makeup? Right? Is it come down to, look, you've got the genetic makeup of a male. You are a male. You have your anatomy demonstrates you're a male. Your genetic makeup makes you a male. You are a male. It doesn't matter what you identify as. That's the legal definition of what a male is. And that's the legal definition of what a woman is. Now, if we're going to create a situation where now that is fluid and you can identify as one, identify as another, and now your sex is determined, your gender is determined by what you identify as, and then you can claim that you're being discriminated against because there are restrictions to a woman participating or a man participating in this activity. And you say, wait, I'm transgender. And even though I'm biologically a male, I identify as a woman. You can't discriminate against me. Then this law, on the surface, it protects from discrimination. This opens up a whole new meaning of discrimination. And this could create all kinds of chaos and problems. And we're definitely going to at some point, society is going to have to figure that out. We're going to enter into a world where chaos is going to reign in that area. And when it comes to religious institutions, I'll end with this. Religious institutions. Listen, churches, don't conduct yourself like a business. Act like a church. Don't be engaged in business activities where you could be held to business discriminatory laws. Act like a church. And then if we get challenged, say, I'm not operating as a business. I'm operating as a church. I'm operating as a ministry. All right. A church and a ministry don't be renting out your building. Don't be doing all this business kind of stuff. Act like a church, right? Don't rent out your services as a minister just to marry anyone, but you're only going to pick who you marry. That's a business. Be a minister. So I think that's very, very, very important. And then I would this goes right along with that, to the church, to Christians. And mainly to Christian business owners. Just remember, when you get caught up in all of this, just make sure you're being consistent. If you want to fire people and not hire people off a moral reason, don't just make homosexuality and transgender the only issue. You've got to be morally consistent. I'm not going to hire people who watch porn. I'm not going to hire people who are married and divorced and who are involved in an adulterous relationship. I'm not going to marry people who are committing I'm not going to hire people who are committing, premarital sex. If you're going to have some moral code where you're like, nope, that's where I draw the line, the world's going to constantly point out all your inconsistencies. And then you just end up making yourself look foolish. You've got to be consistent in those areas. But this decision may seem to be insignificant to you right now, but this seems to be having major ramifications. And when people are talking about it, realize that there's a lot of different levels here. We got the legal level, may have some legal problems with how this decision was made, but there's no going back. It's already been made. Number two, we have the discrimination issue, which we all want some kind of protection. You don't want a business out there, you go apply for the job, and I'm not hiring you because you're a Christian. You would claim that's being persecuted and you're being discriminated against. Well, the protections you want, you have to give other people. The freedoms you want, you have to give other people. Just keep that in mind. And third, the transgender issue is where this really gets complicated, because now we got discrimination tied to, well, hey, you're discriminating against me because I'm a man, but I feel like I'm a woman, so you can't discriminate against me. You got to treat me like a woman. This is literally going to force us now to legally recognize people from a legal perspective, that you've got to treat that woman or treat that person as a woman, even though they're clearly a man, and you've got to give them the same access and the same ability to do certain things that have been restricted to just a man or just a woman, like, locker room, sports, and a lot of issues. This is going to open up a really a mess. And that's just going to be, we'll see how they're going to use Title VII now. And this is going to be very interesting to see. But that's what's happening in your world. I'm telling you, it's more important than ever for Christians to develop a biblical worldview, but we've got to get back to being spiritual. We need the Bible, we need church, we need repentance, we need prayer, we need fasting, we need to have our spiritual weapons, we need to be thinking spiritually, because the world is moving at 1,000,000 miles a second. It's moving away from Christianity. And you're going to have to learn how to live in a non-Christian world. And you cannot do that trying to fight this from a political standpoint. This requires spiritual warfare. And I hope we can get back to that. All right. I know I give a lot of thoughts. Hopefully, I tried to be thoughtful. When you try to be thoughtful and you're not just one-sided, that's where everyone you get shot by both sides. But I tried to be thoughtful here, and hopefully something good will come from all of this. All right, I'm going to stop right there. You can email me at newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. Everyone have a great day. Pray for our world. God bless.